On September 28, 1888, dawn in Sage Hollow came with a skin of ice on every rain barrel and a measured 24 degrees in the shade behind the church, the sort of dry cutting cold that arrived too early for comfort and too late for surprise on the Dakota edge, where weather did not announce itself as season but as verdict. The town sat in a shallow bowl of grass and wind, 318 souls between the freight road and a narrow creek that ran mean by August and hard by January, its boardwalks uneven, its false fronts proud, its people accustomed to scarcity so long as scarcity came in familiar form. That morning a buckboard rolled in from the north, iron rims ringing against frozen ruts, and behind it rode a widower named Travis Fisher with 2 blackened kettles, 1 bedroll, a chest of tools, and a ledger wrapped in oilcloth as if it were scripture. He did not come as a speculator or a man with company backing. He came with $412 in folded notes, 2 mules, and the patient caution of someone who had buried 1 life already and did not intend to bury another by haste. His wife, Elina Fisher, had died in late February of the previous year in Minnesota, pine country, after a lung fever that took hold during a long smoke run, when she had stood over wet hardwood for 2 nights to save a winter's stores and paid for it with breath she never recovered. Her death was not theatrical and not brief. She weakened by increments, still measuring salt with her thumb and forefinger while she could stand, still correcting his knots on hanging lines from a chair when she could not. By the time thaw opened the creek, she was gone, and Travis had folded her ledger shut on a line that read, in careful hand, "Do not trust March sun on January stores." He repeated the chain of his knowledge whenever anyone asked, and sometimes when no one asked, because he considered attribution part of honesty. Elina had learned from her father in Finnish winter country, where meat rotted in 1 bad week if smoke was damp and froze to waste if air did not move. Travis had learned from Elina by hand, not by pride. Measured salt, timed air, patient fire, no shortcuts for fear and no faith in luck. In Minnesota, that knowledge had carried them through 3 killing winters when wagon flour did not arrive and venison spoiled in neighbors' sheds. In Dakota territory, it looked to most eyes like obsession. The land agent at Sage Hollow offered him 2 choices on the day of arrival, and only one at a price he could pay without debt. For $22, he could rent 4 acres north of town, open to every wind, low enough that frost lingered in spring and wheat had failed twice in 5 years. Surveyors called it poor ground and dismissed it from serious maps. Travis took it before noon, signed with a steady hand, and rode out to stake corners while dust and frost traded places under his boots. He marked out a rectangle near a rise where drainage would hold true, then paced 37 steps to the creek for water carry and 49 steps to the road for winter access. By sundown, he had tied rags on willow stakes and set his kettles upside down against drifting grit. From the porch of the general store, Orrin Pemberton watched the work with a merchant's practiced stillness and a smile sharpened by certainty. He was a broad man in his 40s, heavy through the waist from sitting profitably, with broadcloth coats cut in St. Louis style, polished boots that rarely met mud, and a watch chain bright enough to catch lantern light across a room. He had grown prosperous on credit books and winter fear, selling flour, lamp oil, and reassurance in equal measure. He called down to a wagon team loading barley and said, loud enough for 3 doorways to hear, that Fisher was digging himself a grand cold tomb and ought to carve the date now, while the ground still yielded. By supper, the joke had become a name. The project was Fisher's grave. Mockery in Sage Hollow traveled like smoke in still weather, entering every seam. Women buying calico laughed that he planned to pickle himself. Teamsters asked whether widowers in Minnesota slept underground with badgers. Boys ran along his boundary line and shouted, "Grave man! Grave man!" until one of them stumbled in loose clay and cried hard enough to be carried home. Travis did not answer any of it. He hauled limestone from a cut 2 miles south, paid in cash, and stacked each block by thickness: 8-inch faces for inner courses, 6-inch faces for the outer skin, chips reserved for wedge and drain fill. A man who lived by stored food had little use for spoken contests. On the 16th of October, the weather made its first hard declaration. Before dawn, the thermometer nailed to Pemberton's store post read 19 degrees, and by first light, kitchen gardens lay flat and black. Squash vines collapsed into ropes, bean poles sheathed in white. 2 shallow wells on the west lane locked with ice at the lip, and teamsters spent an hour breaking water with axe heads before cattle would drink. Near noon, a telegraph rider came through from the line west of Jamestown with news that 2 trestle repairs had failed and rail shipments were moving slow, or not at all. The town heard delay. Travis heard fracture. He had been watching signs for 3 weeks, signs that did not persuade men with full shelves. Geese crossed south in long, urgent files almost a fortnight ahead of the common date. Beaver crowns on the creek rose high above normal banks, packed tight with willow and mud, as if built against deep force. Most telling, the north wind held after sunset, dry and unwavering, refusing the expected night drop that often gave men their brief labor hour before dawn freeze. He did not make a speech in the street. He rode to the quarry, then to the tinsmith, then to the store for salt, and paid what was asked while prices still resembled reason. By the close of that week, he had spent $41 total for limestone blocks, stovepipe lengths, coarse salt, and 2 extra shovels. The smokehouse began as geometry cut into stubborn earth. He laid out 14 feet by 10 with cord and pegs, stripped the sod in squares for later patching, and dug to 8 feet below grade with side slopes, braced by scrap planks until stone could hold. Day by day, the pit deepened. Spoil mounded windward as partial berm, then trimmed and tamped. He set a floor of compacted clay over 6 inches of gravel for drainage, sloped 1 inch every 6 feet toward a sump crock in the southeast corner, and lined the first wall course dry to test true before bedding in clay mortar mixed with chopped straw. The double wall system took shape with an 8-inch gap between inner and outer stone skins, the cavity packed tight in lifts, clay, straw, then clay again, rammed with a hardwood block until the wall rang dull under knuckles. Thermal mass was not a theory to him. It was arithmetic written in labor. He framed the ceiling with green cottonwood beams, peeled clean and set close, decked them with split plank, then covered that deck with tarred canvas, a full foot of packed earth, and finally the reclaimed sod, so that from the road the roof appeared less like a building than a low rise in the field. The entry came through a narrow descending trench angled from the leeward side, with a plank door at surface and a heavier inner door below to trap temperature between chambers. For smoke, he laid a small external firebox 12 feet from the main chamber and linked it by buried flue, stovepipe inside a clay sleeve, pitched upward at a careful grade so heat softened and smoke arrived clean. He cut a vent shaft near the chamber crown with an adjustable iron plate, no wider than a man's wrist, enough to keep flow moving and damp out without drawing flame. By the first week of November, the structure stood complete enough to hold trial fires, and faint blue strands began to rise from the hidden vent at dawn, carrying the sweet, dry scent of cottonwood and maple scrap across the north edge of town. Souls passing on the road covered noses and laughed that Fisher had finally lit his own burial. Orrin Pemberton, leaning against flour barrels on his porch, called to a knot of ranch hands that honest men built houses under sky, not holes for fear, then offered a discount on new kerosene lamps to any household that preferred modern confidence to widow's lore. Travis tamped fresh clay around the flue joint, checked draft with a strip of wool, and said nothing. He worked until dark, then wrote weights and temperatures in Elena's ledger by lantern light, preparing for a winter that had already shown its hand. That night, the trial fire burned low and disciplined in the outer box, a narrow bed of coals no longer than Travis's forearm, fed with cottonwood splits shaved thin so the chamber would take smoke without sudden heat. And by midnight, the thermometer he hung on an inner peg held at 53 degrees, while outside the wind carved the dark at 19. He stood in the lower passage with Elena's ledger open against his palm and copied 3 figures by lantern light. Intake draft, 1 finger wide, vent plate at 1/4 turn. Humidity kept dry enough that wool tied near the vent did not dampen. Stakes on the roofline clicked in gusts. The walls did not answer. Stone and packed clay held steady. At first light, he began loading the chamber in careful sequence, not by convenience but by fat content and cure time. Heavier pork shoulders nearest the coolest interior corner. Venison hams higher where circulation ran cleanest. Belly cuts hung with 2 inches of space between each slab, so no surface touched and no moisture pooled. He weighed each side on a hanging spring scale, called out the number to no one, then wrote it down in a column Elena had taught him to keep. Raw weight, salt charge, first smoke date, target pull date. A settler woman passing on the road paused to watch, then turned away when she recognized him, as if acknowledging skill would require acknowledging her own neglect. By November 4th, with dawn temperatures hovering between 12 and 16, he had 620 pounds in staggered tiers across iron hooks and willow rods, and every pound had passed through the same cure arithmetic. 2 1/2 pounds coarse salt per 100 pounds meat, a 1/2 pound brown sugar where trade allowed, black pepper only for fly season, and therefore omitted now, then a rest in cool shade before smoke. He rendered tallow in one of the blackened kettles until the liquid ran clear and faintly sweet, poured it through linen into stoneware crocks, sealed each crock with waxed cloth and twine, and stacked them on cedar planks raised 2 inches above floor level against ground moisture. The work looked excessive to neighbors who still trusted thin plank sheds and lucky weather. To Travis, it looked unfinished. 3 days later, as the first week of November closed, Orrin Pemberton shifted from mockery to control. He had heard, from 2 ranch wives and a freighter, that households on the South Lane were asking whether they might cure small cuts in root cellars and share smoke runs to stretch lard and flour, and he understood at once what that meant for a merchant whose winter margins depended on panic. From the scale platform beside his store, he announced a new wagon policy in a tone of business routine. Travis Fisher would be charged premium weighing and loading rates because his grave enterprise consumed dock space and invited nuisance traffic. The rate doubled by afternoon. No ordinance required it. No one challenged it. By supper that same day, he raised salt from 2 cents a pound to 6 cents for any account holder seen carrying sacks toward Northfield pits. And when questioned by Jonas Creel at the hitch rail, he answered with a smile that scarcity punished poor planning, not honest trade, then pointed at Travis across the street and added, loud enough for 7 listeners, that fear spread faster than blight and ought to be priced accordingly. The line stayed in memory because it held the cruelty of wit without the burden of responsibility. Men repeated it in the barbershop. Women repeated it near the pump. Children repeated it without understanding a word of it. Travis responded as he had responded to everything else, by extending his preparations into systems that did not require permission. He bought 2 coils of hemp rope, each 60 feet, at full price from a passing peddler rather than from town stock, soaked both in linseed and ash to stiffen fibers against wet freeze, then stretched them between his doorpost and 3 buried anchor stones set chest high above expected drift. He marked hand intervals with wrapped cloth every 4 feet so movement could continue by touch in blowing white. He dug the access trench 1 foot deeper and widened turning points to carry crates without binding shoulders. He split another cord and a half of cottonwood, stacked it beneath oiled canvas over slat runners, and left a 6-inch air gap at the back of every stack so snowmelt would not rot the bottom course. Lena Crow came at midday with a basket of mending and a question she had not asked at home because no adult in her house welcomed what they called North Field talk. She was 14 and long-limbed with a calm way of standing that made her seem older until she spoke. She waited by the trench lip until Travis looked up from tamping clay around a flue sleeve, then asked why he had tied ropes in clear weather and why he kept measuring wind at sunset. He set down the maul and answered in the same grave register he used for ledger entries. "Wind is weather while men can choose their direction," he said. "When it steals direction, it becomes a weapon. Snow then does not fall. It hunts corners and doors. A door above ground is a promise drift will break." She listened without interruption, then asked how a person could move if sight failed. He showed her the cloth markers on the guideline, counted intervals with her gloved hand, and told her she was never to test that path during full blow, only to remember it and repeat it to elders who still thought storms obeyed daylight. He accepted no payment for the lesson and no praise for giving it. She returned 2 days later with a lard tin and a sack of dry beans set quietly at the trench wall. And before dawn, someone else added onions wrapped in newspaper, then a bundle of kindling tied with feed twine. Pride had not broken in Sage Hollow. It had begun to crack. On December 2nd, the first real storm reached town before sunrise, not the teasing squalls of October, but a driving white front that erased fence lines by noon and turned the freight road into a smooth, deceptive plain. 2 sled teams from the east were stranded within sight of the church steeple, horses shaking under crusted harness, while men dug at drifts that refilled as fast as shovels rose. The courthouse bell rang at 1 in the afternoon to call hands for rescue, and for 6 hours souls moved in relay lines between barn doors and windbreaks, faces wrapped in wool, eyes narrowed to slits. By dark, the gusts eased. By morning, they had passed. Then came the false calm. For 6 days, the sky held pale and wide. Noon sun softened ruts on south-facing lanes, and boys played at breaking crust with boot heels, while merchants stepped into doorways and announced that the hard weather had spent itself early. Pemberton leaned against his porch rail in a new wool coat and told any who paused that Providence favored confidence over fear, that his heaters and lamps had carried prudent homes through the only serious blow they would see before Christmas. He sold out of lamp chimneys in 48 hours. He extended credit with generous pen strokes. He did not restock salt. Travis read the calm as warning, not relief, because calm after an early hard storm often meant pressure building farther north, and because the night wind still held from the dry quarter instead of turning soft from the creek. By the second week of December, he had added a second internal rack, arranged purchase and cure staging for an additional 180 pounds of ranch cull at 3 cents a pound, and mapped 4 rope-linked routes on a board slate: Crow Cabin, Ellery Schoolhouse, Klein's Seam Room above the Cooper Shed, Boone Place near West Draw. He measured each route in paces, noted obstacles likely to vanish under drift, and drove marker stakes wrapped in red cloth where ground swales could trap a cart axle or a man's knee. He kept the slate by the inner door. On December 21st, the stage from Bismarck did not arrive. No wheel noise sounded on the East Road by noon. No team came by dusk. At first light on December 22nd, a rider from Granite Falls brought clipped news from the line. A second telegram had failed to transmit after relay damage. Trestle repairs west of Jamestown had not merely slowed freight, but halted whole sections. Coal was short at 2 depots and grain cars sat iced in place. Delay had become breakage across the region. Sage Hollow was no longer waiting on shipments. It was cut from them. Before noon that same day, Travis brought in the staged ranch cull, ran the full salt measure from Elina's columns, and set the additional 180 pounds onto the new rack for smoke under tight draft. That morning, Travis moved from private endurance to community contingency without announcement and without ceremony. He shifted 3 crocks of tallow and 6 sacks of beans from his own rack to a shared shelf near the entry landing. He posted a simple ration board by charcoal mark where all could see it. Broth, first for the weak, then children, then labor hands. Meat by ounce, not by claim. Fuel by watch, not by argument. He gave Lena a short stick of chalk and 4 folded slips naming routes and timings, then instructed her to carry them house to house, only in daylight, and only while wind stayed below strong flag. She went. Many doors did not open. Some opened just enough for a hand to take the slip and disappear. Yet by next dawn, more tins and sacks appeared at the trench than he had delivered, and they appeared from households that had laughed the loudest in October. In town, Orrin Pemberton locked his back rooms and posted emergency prices in the church vestibule. Flour dearer by half, lamp oil doubled, salt sold by the ounce. But the paper notices looked suddenly foolish in the face of roads no wagon could cross. By evening, he stood in his own storeroom, counting barrels he could not move to anyone who needed them, while on the north field a buried chamber glowed warm beneath earth and waited for the weather to make its final demand. The same evening, while Orrin Pemberton counted immovable barrels by lamplight, Travis knelt at the lower threshold of the smokehouse and altered the place from a keeper's chamber into a winter works. He drove 2 additional pegs into the east wall at shoulder height and hung a slate board for fuel rotation, then marked 3 columns in careful script: cottonwood for smoke, willow for quick heat, buffalo chips for emergency burn when wood could not be fetched. He moved his private tool chest beneath the stair bench and replaced it with a common crate of awls, twine, spare mittens, and 2 hand lamps, whose chimneys he wrapped in wire to keep them from shattering when dropped. At the sump crock in the southeast corner, he reset the clay lip and cleared the gravel throat with a bent spoon so meltwater would not stand underfoot and turn the packed floor to slick mud. Above him, wind rasped across the sod roof in long, dry passes. Below, he made each station answer a specific failure before the failure arrived. He measured what remained as rigorously as he had measured what he cured. The chamber held 8 full pork shoulders, 19 venison hams, 21 strips of belly meat, and smaller cuts enough for broth stock, totaling by his ledger 641 pounds after trim and early shrink. Tallow stood at 14 sealed crocks. Dry beans, counting his own, and the quiet offerings at the trench reached 11 sacks by rough weight, each near 40 pounds. There were 6 sacks of split peas, 3 bins of onions, 2 of turnips, and a sack and a half of cracked barley. He turned every container so labels faced outward and marked ration equivalents beside them. 1 pound smoked meat to feed 5 adults in soup, 1 quart beans to thicken 2 kettles, 1 crock tallow to extend 20 loaves if flour came, 10 if it did not. Numbers would settle arguments that hunger sharpened. By dawn, he had begun enlarging the exterior system that fed the chamber. The original firebox, built for steady curing, did not cast enough direct heat to shelter many souls through an extended blow. So he opened a second pit 3 yards leeward and lined it with fieldstone set dry for speed, then skirted the outside with clay to seal drafts. He laid an iron plate across its mouth, not to boil in ordinary weather, but to hold a communal kettle when roads closed and no house could keep a stable flame. Because drifting snow could choke any low vent in one night, he cut 2 spare vent shafts from stovepipe lengths, each wrapped in burlap and wire, each fitted with a cap of punch tin so smoke could leave while driven powder could not enter. He staged them beside the door, ready to be set if the main draw failed. The work had the discipline of ship-rigging on inland ground, every part redundant, every redundancy placed where cold fingers could find it by touch. 3 days passed before the town understood that his digging had not ended with the first chamber. When the afternoon light cleared enough for sighting across Northfield, men from the Cooper Sheed saw him and Lena dragging split planks on a hand sledge, laying them as trench covers in alternating sections, so a rope line could be followed and yet opened quickly where shovels were needed. He cut each plank to 5 feet, bored finger holes through both ends, and lashed them in pairs, making hinged lids that could be lifted even when frozen. At every 10 paces, he sank a cedar post with a cross notch, then threaded secondary guide ropes from post to post, so movement could continue if one line snapped. Lina copied each distance on her slate and repeated them aloud until she could speak the route as a litany. Door to first post, 8 paces, first to second, 10, second to bend, 6, bend to road marker, 12. The expansion drew not gratitude but louder contempt, because systems visible in calm weather accused those who had built none. Pemberton began calling the place Fisher Warren, as if changing the joke could dilute its sting, and he repeated the name to customers while he stacked goods behind his counter and refused credit except at severe terms. He told the blacksmith that Travis was drilling children in panic, and that no decent settlement entrusted discipline to a man who lived under earth. He told the church deacons that rope paths invited theft after dark. He told ranch hands that a buried chamber would turn foul and suffocate any family foolish enough to crowd it. None of these claims needed proof. They needed only repetition and a speaker whose coat still looked prosperous. Social punishment followed speech. On market morning, when Travis brought 2 cured haunches for lawful trade, the scale clerk recorded their weight but posted him last for service, though he had arrived first. And by the time his turn came, 2 buyers had left under pressure from men who preferred Pemberton's displeasure to Fisher's meat. At the pump, women who had once accepted smoke cure scraps in October stepped away with their buckets when Lena approached, then resumed conversation in lower tones once she had passed. At the schoolhouse stove, older boys repeated the new nickname and stamped their boots in rabbit hops when she entered, drawing laughter that ceased only when Ruth Ellery fixed them with a look and assigned extra copywork. The cruelty was diffuse, often deniable, and therefore effective. Travis met it with the same answer he had offered from the first day, a manner of work that did not bargain for dignity from those unwilling to give it. When the scale clerk delayed him, he waited without protest, collected his coin, and returned to trench carpentry before dusk. When a deacon warned him that gathering provisions outside church supervision bred disorder, he nodded once and asked only whether the church cellar held dry wood enough for 7 nights, a practical question the deacon did not answer. When 2 teamsters mocked his rope knots as seaman tricks for landlocked fear, he handed one a length and showed him a mitten knot that could be tied blind in high wind, then walked on before the man could decide whether to laugh or learn. His silence was not surrender. It was allocation. By the week after Christmas, that allocation had turned the Northfield into a mapped, disciplined compound. He cut a narrow ice trench to the creek where water still moved under crust, lined it with brush to prevent slips, and hung a bell on the first post so anyone reaching the upper bend could signal for help without wasting breath. He built a low snow baffle from discarded fence rails on the windward side of the main door, set at 45 degrees to split the drift and keep entry depth manageable. He set aside one corner inside for the infirm with extra wool and a tighter lampshade, another for children where heat held most evenly, and a third for cooking where steam could be managed without wetting wall courses. Each corner received a mark in charcoal, and a simple rule posted beneath. No corner belonged to him. The town watched and interpreted according to pride. Some said he was preparing to charge admission once cold truly set. Some said he meant to make himself indispensable and then govern by ration. Pemberton fed both stories while his own backroom locks multiplied. He held evening talks on his porch, promising that ordered commerce would carry Sage Hollow through any ordinary January, and he displayed crates of lamp oil and bolts of wool as proof of capacity, while omitting mention that flour barrels were down by a third and salt casks nearly gone. He still posted emergency prices in the vestibule. He still called that policy prudence. Yet 2 of his own clerks began sending small parcels by their younger brothers to the trench at dawn, and even they did not say so aloud. On the first Monday of January, with sky hard and bright over drifts that no longer softened at noon, Travis began formal drills. He did not announce them as drills. He called them deliveries. Lena and 2 younger boys from the West Lane carried empty sacks along Route 3, while he timed their passage by pocket watch and corrected their spacing on the line, never more than 1 arm length apart in wideout, never less than half that in open stretch where a stumble could pull both down. He taught them to test plank lids with heel taps before weight, to clear vent mouths from the leeward side, to keep one mittened hand on rope while the other used shovel, and to count breaths in sets of 20 when fear narrowed the chest. He ran the same route at dusk with lantern hoods down to slits, practicing for darkness he believed would arrive at midday when the true blow came. That evening, the warning signs gathered in plain view for any soul willing to read land as carefully as ledger. A ring formed around the moon, wide and sharp. Not the soft halo of high moisture, but a hard-edged circle with a second faint band beyond it. An old stockman on the road glanced up, then looked down quickly, unwilling to narrate what they knew. Dogs that usually slept under porches whined and scratched at doors long before full dark. Horses in the hitch line turned their hindquarters to the north and kept them there, refusing grain until stalls were closed. At the creek, the running seam narrowed to black thread and then stilled without full freeze, as if pressure elsewhere had clenched the channel shut. Travis noted each sign on Alina's page margin and reduced the next day's smoke to preserve fuel for heat. By Wednesday, the 7th of January, even ordinary chores carried a brittle urgency. Ash from cookstoves rose straight at dawn, and then, by mid-morning, bent flat to the south in a single sheet, indicating a high, fast current above ground level, while surface air remained unnervingly still. Fine snow that had lain harmless for days began to creep in thin ribbons across packed drifts, not yet driven, only seeking direction. Ravens gathered on the church crossbeam in numbers no one recalled seeing at once and left before sunset in one black, hurried line. Lena brought this report from 3 households while collecting tins. Candles burned with short blue bases, doors shrank in frames from dry cold, and one infant in the crow cabin coughed from air so sharp it seemed to cut. Travis shifted more bedding to the infirm corner and doubled broth stock with turnip and barley to stretch meat without losing strength. Yet public confidence, though fraying, made one final stand. Pemberton opened his porch talk on the 8th with a ledger in hand and declared that the weather office in Fargo had issued no extraordinary warning by wire, that storms this far north always looked worse in rumor, and that business, not panic, remained the proper Christian answer. He offered reduced rates on patent heaters to any household paying cash that day. 5 men bought. 2 could not carry their purchases home through the drifts and left them tied on the boardwalk, where snow began covering the crates before evening prayer ended. From the vestibule notice board, his emergency prices remained posted, the ink stiff in the cold. Travis spent that same afternoon setting final contingencies. He boiled 2 kettles of bone broth, cooled them in shallow pans, and skimmed fat into reserve jars. He pre-cut kindling bundles by watch interval, each bundle tied for 1 hour of low burn, and stacked them beside both fire pits. He moved the community keyring Lena had assembled, church cellar, schoolhouse, cooper shed, 3 side doors whose owners had consented, onto a nail by the inner threshold, and scratched the order of use into the door plank. He walked each rope route once more with her at his shoulder, checking knots, clearing drifts from post tops, and replacing 2 cloth markers stripped by gusts. At the end of the last route, near the Boone Lane marker, they paused while a distant sound carried from the north, not thunder and not wagon, but a long, continuous rush like grain pouring from a great height. Night fell early on the 8th, and the cold settled with a severity that made lamp glass sing when touched. At supper hour, the thermometer outside the smokehouse door read -21. By full dark, it had dropped to -28 and still falling. Travis banked the inner fire, set the vent plate to a narrow draw, and told Lena to sleep in boots near the stair so no minute would be lost if the bell rang. Across Sage Hollow, shutters were barred, stoves fed hard, and prayers spoken over tables where flour had already been measured too thin. Near midnight, the first hard gust struck from the north and did not pass, and by 1 in the morning, snow began moving sideways across the trench covers in a pale, relentless sheet. The second gust struck harder than the first and carried no lull behind it, only a deepening force that pressed against doors, roof sod, and lungs with the blunt persistence of a loaded freight car. Snow did not descend in flakes by then. It moved laterally in torn white sheets, driven so fast that lantern light outside became a flat glow without depth, and the rope line above the trench began to hum where ice crystals skinned the hemp. Travis rose before the bell sounded, pulled on his outer coat over wool already stiff with old smoke, and checked 3 points in practice sequence: vent draw, inner door seal, and firebox draft, all held. At 1:30 in the morning on January 9th, 1889, his outside thermometer read -31 degrees. By 2:15 it read -34. Lena reached the upper hatch first as he had ordered, 1 hand on rope and 1 hand over her scarf, then slid down the stair with her lashes white and her words clipped by cold. The Crow chimney had backdrafted, she said, and snow was piling against 3 doors on West Lane. Travis handed her the wire-wrapped lamp, opened the inner door only long enough to preserve chamber heat, and stepped into the trench where drift already sat at thigh level. The wind struck like thrown gravel. He clipped his mitten through the guide and began moving by counted markers rather than sight, shovel blade low to find plank seams before his boot weight did. Lena stayed 2 paces behind, repeating intervals into the roar so neither would lose rhythm. By dawn, the storm had erased every line that made Sage Hollow legible in ordinary weather. Fence posts, wagon tongues, watering troughs, and barrel stacks were absorbed into one continuous contour that shifted with every gust. The church steeple remained visible only as a dark wedge when wind thinned for a heartbeat, then vanished again in white velocity. At 7 in the morning, Orrin Pemberton opened his storefront with 2 clerks and discovered that his porch drifts had risen to the hitch rail and his side shutters had frozen inward against warped frames. He ordered his men to clear the entry and bring lamp oil from the back room, still speaking as if schedule governed outcome. But before the first crate crossed the threshold, a crosswind blew the front sign loose and drove it down the steps into the drift where it disappeared completely. He sent 1 clerk to the vestibule to recover the emergency price notices. The clerk returned without them. The papers had shredded to pulp against wet boards. The town's private plans failed in layers through the morning. Patent heaters sold in confidence burned through coal faster than promised, and then sat cold, iron bellies clinking as rooms dropped below freezing. Thin plank sheds packed with autumn meat, lost roof seams under wind load, and powdered snow entered through knotholes until rafters wore white ridges on their interior faces. Two families tried to move from separate houses into one larger parlor and discovered midway that the lane between them had drifted above waist depth with a crust that cracked under each step, throwing adults to one knee and children to both hands. A ranch bunkhouse west of town held at first, then lost its stovepipe cap and filled with smoke until the men inside had to choose between choking air and open door. They opened the door. The wind took their blankets across the yard and pinned one against a fence they could no longer see. At the smokehouse, conditions remained harsh but governed. The chamber floor stayed dry because the sump throat was clear. The inner thermometer held between 51 and 55 degrees, warm enough to preserve hands and breath, cool enough to keep meat sound. Travis began emergency intake at 9 o'clock, admitting souls in ordered groups of 3 to prevent heat collapse in the entry lock, then assigning each arrival to corners by need, not status. Infirm to east wall near shielded lamp, children to south bench under extra wool, labor hands to stair side for quick turn to trench duty. He cut ration strips by scale. 1 1/4 ounces smoked meat per adult at first distribution, broth thickened with beans for those who could not chew, and hot water with tallow skim for those already shivering beyond speech. There was no argument over portions because he read each number aloud and marked each draw on the slate where all could see. By late afternoon on the 9th, winds were measured as near 60 miles per hour by the anemometer cup behind the schoolhouse before the instrument arm snapped. The reading was reported by Jonas Creel, who shouted it down the rope line and then returned to digging at the school drift. Night temperatures fell to -37. The weather was not wind anymore. It was a tool of pressure and erasure, driving snow under eaves, through keyholes, and up from ground eddies so that even sheltered doors sealed from both sides at once. The bell on Travis's first post rang twice before midnight, and then went silent when rhyme froze the clapper in place. He and Lena shifted to lantern signals along Route 2. Hood up for stop, hood down for advance, each motion rehearsed in calmer days and now paid for in breath. Ruth Ellery died before the second midnight. She had dismissed her pupils at noon on the 9th and tied attendance slates in cloth under her arm to keep names and sums dry for the week she assumed would follow. Near dusk, she stepped from the schoolhouse toward the coal shed, a path of 10 measured steps she had walked for 3 winters, and whiteout reduced those 10 steps to blind distance. When the rescue line reached her lane after dark, they found her half-turned toward the door she had left, slates still bound, one glove pulled partly free as if she had tried to clear her eyes for a final orientation. She was carried to the church because there was no room for grief in the trench at that hour. Only record and return. Lena wrote her name on the slate board by Travis's ration column so no one would ask where she had gone. Eli Boone, 17 years old and broad-shouldered from fence work, chose his own risk in the early morning dark of the 10th when his mother's flour sack failed and the Boone stove had gone low. He lashed a 20-pound sack from the church cellar over one shoulder and took Route 4 toward West Draw, insisting he could break trail faster alone than with a slower pair behind him. He made the first marker and the second. At the third, where the line crossed an open dip, gusts tore the top crust and dropped him thigh-deep into sugar snow that refilled each step hole before he could set the next. The line crew reached him less than an hour later. The flour sack remained tied in place. He did not survive the crossing. His mother received the flour and wept without sound, hands pressed to the coarse weave as though it were his coat sleeve. Marta Klein died on the third day, January 11th, when fuel arithmetic failed in a room built for one seamstress and not for siege weather. She had lived above the Cooper shed for 6 years. hemming coats and mending wagon canvas for families who paid in coin when they had coin, and in potatoes when they did not. Her stove had draft trouble since November. She had reported it twice and delayed repair twice because others were judged in greater need. When rescue reached her stair after noon, they found her seated upright beside an unlit stove, back straight, gloves folded in her lap, two finished children's mittens placed neatly on the table, as if she expected the mothers to arrive any moment. Travis removed his cap when her body passed through the trench, though his hair froze at the temples for the gesture. Desperation mounted not as panic, but as subtraction. By the fourth watch on the 10th, most households had burned through easy fuel and begun breaking furniture legs, fence rails, and tool handles. Water buckets froze near hearths unless covered. Kerosene lamp chimneys cracked when carried room to room. In 2 cabins, infants were kept under coats against adult skin because ambient air near the floor was too cold for ordinary blankets. Men who had mocked rope lines now held those ropes with both hands and moved as instructed, counting cloth markers allowed to prove they remained connected. Women who had crossed streets to avoid smoke scent now stood over Travis's communal kettle, stirring bean broth by his clock, taking turns exactly as posted because routine prevented fear from seizing the room. The contrast was visible in every task. Above ground, private stores failed by isolation. Below ground, shared stores endured by method. Near sunset on the 10th, while the storm still held full force and the trench walls had to be cut twice per shift to remain passable, help came from the quarter that had resisted longest. Orrin Pemberton appeared at the outer rope with no hat brim left to shape, coat torn at one sleeve, face raw where blown ice had stripped skin, and both hands empty. His clerks were behind him carrying nothing but a wrapped ledger and one dented kettle. He did not attempt his porch voice. He did not offer terms. At the inner threshold, he reached inside his coat, placed the ring of store keys in Travis's palm, and spoke with the spare clarity of a man who had run out of arguments. "I have barrels I cannot move, and shelves I cannot heat," he said. "Tell me where to carry water." Travis looked at the keys once, then hung them on the nail beneath the community ring without comment on ownership or debt. He pointed to the second kettle station, assigned Pemberton and both clerks to snowmelt duty in 4-hour turns, and instructed them to carry each full pail first to the infirm corner, second to children, third to cooks, fourth to trench crews. No condition was attached. No apology was requested. Work began immediately. Through that night and the next day, Pemberton hauled water up and down the stair until his shoulders shook, then resumed after each broth interval, because thirst did not pause for shame. By the morning of January the 12th, the Smokehouse held 30 souls in rotating shelter, with others cycling through for heat, food, and road assignments before returning to homes still salvageable. 12 had been pulled in during the first black hours. 18 more had been pulled in by dawn after that first night, January 9th to 10th, when drifts rose above windowsills and buried entire door fronts. Travis kept count on slate, not for pride but to prevent omission. Names entered at intake, names crossed only on confirmed return or confirmed death. When wind reached a pitch too high for safe travel, he suspended non-essential movement and ordered all hands to interior tasks: vent clearing, broth prep, bedding dry out near shielded heat, rope repair under lantern. When gusts eased by a narrow margin, he reopened route pairs with Lena leading marker checks because her memory for intervals remained exact under stress. The blizzard continued through January 13th with little variance, a sustained assault of cold and white force that made noon resemble unlit dusk and reduced the town's architecture to buried outlines and smoke holes. Yet each hour survived inside the chamber converted crisis into obligation, and obligation into a discipline no ridicule could unwind. The walls held. The ledger stayed dry. the kettle did not empty. And when another knock sounded at the upper hatch just before nightfall on the 13th, Travis rose from the ration board, took up the lamp, and opened the door again. The knock came from Jonas Creel and two ranch hands carrying Alma Boone between them, wrapped in a horse blanket and rigid from the waist down, after a stovepipe collapse filled her cabin with smoke and forced her into the drift while they cleared it. Travis drew them through the lock one at a time, sealed the inner door, and sent Pemberton for hot water before a single question was asked. Alma was set near the east wall, boots loosened, hands warm by cloth and breath rather than direct flame, while Lena read the slate and shifted rations to cover 4 new mouths without reducing the infirm share. By dawn on January 14th, the wind had lost its scream and dropped to a hard, steady blow from the northwest, still dangerous but no longer blinding at arm's length. Travis used that margin immediately. He sent 2 rope teams to open blocked entries on West Lane, 1 team to the church cellar for flour and coal under written tally, and 1 to Pemberton's store with the keys and strict instruction that every barrel moved would be marked by weight before distribution. Expensive iron heaters sat cold in parlors across town, fuel spent and seams cracked, while the buried chamber of limestone and clay kept giving off measured warmth at 50 degrees, because Earth did not answer fashion, only physics. That afternoon he carried the keyring back to Pemberton at the lower stair and placed it in his raw hands. "You will open at old prices when doors can hold open," Travis said. "Until then, shelves are inventory for survival, not bargaining." Pemberton nodded once and tucked the keys into his coat without argument. He went straight back to melting snow. When the final gust front passed at dusk, the rescue turned from immediate survival to organized sharing. Travis moved the meat racks into a strict rotation, oldest cuts first, lean pieces for broth, fat pieces for labor crews, and instructed 6 volunteers at a time in slicing against grain, soak times for heavy salt, and kettle sequencing so no fuel was wasted bringing cold iron up twice. He did not lecture. He demonstrated, then handed over the knife. Lena chalked each lesson on a plank by the door in plain terms. 1 pound for 5 adults in soup. Simmer, not boil. Vent half open while kettles run. 3 days passed before the first freight scout reached Sage Hollow from the South Road and confirmed what everyone now understood. Trestle damage and frozen switches had broken regional supply for weeks, and no regular rail provisions would reach them soon. Travis took the report, thanked the rider, and asked only for accurate counts of nearby settlements in similar condition. The rider had none. Guesswork had no place in his ledger. On January 18th, with lanes cut to wagon width and chimneys reopened where possible, the Smokehouse became the town kitchen by consent rather than desperation. Families cooked in shifts under Travis's schedule. Pemberton's clerks weighed flour in front of witnesses and posted each deduction on a board set where all could read. Jonas repaired Marta Klein's stair rail and turned her upstairs room into a mending station for blankets and mittens left wet from trench duty. Ruth Ellery's slates were dried, cleaned, and stacked at the schoolhouse desk. Her neat binding cloth, stiff with frost when found, was folded and placed in the church chest beside the record book. Eli Boone's flour sack was cut into strips for banding shovel handles that had split in cold. Nothing was discarded without use. Nothing was hidden. By the second week of February, the settlement had settled into an austerity that felt less like panic and more like apprenticeship. Every household sent at least 1 pair of hands to the North Field twice each week, not for charity but for instruction. Travis taught cure arithmetic with a scale and chalk, wall packing with alternating lifts of clay and straw, and vent angles using a plumb line hung from a pegged beam. He charged no fee. He required repetition. If a man said he understood, Travis asked him to set the angle again in front of 3 others. If a woman said she had no strength for stone, he set her to salt measure, ledgering, and fire discipline, then had her teach the next pair. Skill moved faster than pride once hunger had made the terms plain. The reckoning came as a gradual thaw of speech, then as formal words when silence no longer served. It began near the pump when Jonas Creel stopped calling the chamber Fisher's grave and corrected a younger teamster who did, saying in a voice meant to carry that the graveyard was South Hill and the warm room that fed his children was North Field. It continued when two women who had crossed streets to avoid Lena now brought her wool thread and asked her to show their daughters the rope count. It deepened when Pemberton removed his emergency notices from the vestibule board, scraped the paste himself, and nailed up a new sheet listing flour, salt, lamp oil, and bean prices at the same rates posted in October, with every account visible line by line. No one applauded him for that sheet. They read it and they remembered. On the first Sunday in March, after roads reopened enough for neighboring ranches to send sleds, Reverend Hale gave over the final portion of gathering to business of survival. Benches were full, coats patched, faces leaner than autumn by several pounds apiece. Pemberton stood from the third row, not the front, and faced the room without his broadcloth coat, wearing a work jacket still stained by kettle steam. "I called this place Fisher's Grave," he said. "I said fear should be priced, and I priced it. I locked goods while roads failed and named that prudence. I watched a man build what I didn't understand and taught you to laugh so I would not have to learn. 3 of our own are dead, and I will not claim I killed them. But I will say my words helped keep us unready. I was wrong." He turned then toward Travis, who stood near the side aisle with Lena and the Boone family. "I ask no easy pardon. I ask to remain useful under terms that keep this town from ever standing where it stood in January." The room held still after he sat. Then others rose, not in rehearsed order, but with the uneven honesty of souls who had rehearsed privately for weeks and still found the speaking difficult. Jonas admitted he had repeated the merchant's lines because mockery was easier than ditch work. A deacon admitted he had warned against unsupervised stores, while his own cellar held no reserve for widows on his lane. One of Pemberton's clerks confessed he had altered Q order in November to delay Travis at the scale, and did so to please a paycheck. 2 ranch wives said they had sent tins by dawn, while publicly scorning the trench at noon. None asked to erase what had been said. Each named it plainly and left it in the open. When the voices quieted, Reverend Hale looked to Travis but did not summon him. Travis stepped forward anyway, removed his gloves, and spoke without raising volume. 3 graves are fresh," he said. "Ruth Ellery carried slates through weather. No teacher should have met alone. Eli Boone took flour to his mother when stronger men stayed near their own stoves. Marta Klein sat waiting in gloves she had sewn for other hands. If you ask me whether I forgive words, forgiveness is smaller than duty today. My wife taught me that stores belong first to the living, and knowledge belongs to whoever will practice it. I did not dig North Field for revenge. I dug it because winter does not negotiate. If you wish to answer what was done, bring shovels on Tuesday. We will dig 2 communal earth smokehouses before next frost, and we will keep ledgers open where everyone can read." That was all. He returned to his bench and didn't speak again during the closing hymn. Work began Tuesday at first light on Church Land and West Lane, with plans copied from Elina's ledger and modified for each plot's drainage. Pemberton hauled stone in his own wagon and posted freight costs at 0 for all construction loads through April. Lena ran chalk lines and checked trench depth with a marked pole, correcting men twice her age when corners drifted out of square. Alma Boone supervised bean and broth kettles for crews. The deacon who had warned against disorder spent 6 straight mornings packing clay lifts until his palms split under gloves. By 30 April, both communal chambers were roofed in sod, flues tested, and sump drains running clear. In May, households began filling them with smoked cuts and sealed crocks under shared rules, drafted in plain language and signed by 39 heads of house. The meat Travis had put up in autumn held by strict ration and careful smoke until the first week of June, as he had promised. When fresh greens finally came from thawed plots, they came to kitchens that had not emptied. Years later, Sage Hollow still counts by memory as much as by census. In 1902, the settlement records list 411 souls, 3 earth-dug smokehouses in regular service, and a standing winter ordinance requiring every household to keep 30 days of staple reserve before first frost. Store prices are posted publicly each Monday from October through March. The school curriculum includes rope route drills by the second week of November, and Ruth Ellery's slates remain in use, her name carved on their storage chest lid, so each child handling them knows the cost at which record was preserved. The phrase changed first in jest, then in respect, then in ordinary speech. Teamsters sizing a foundation now say, "Build it like Fisher, below the wind." Young couples planning first stores ask for Fisher ratios before they ask for wallpaper. Pemberton kept the store and, by every surviving account, kept the board honest afterward, though he never asked anyone to forget the winter when his notices curled wet and useless on a church wall. The original Northfield chamber still stands with its sod roof mended each August, and its limestone courses cool under summer heat. Elina Fisher's ledger, pages smoke dark and margin noted through the blizzard, is kept wrapped in oilcloth in the school cabinet and brought out each autumn for copying by new hands. On the inside lintel above the lower stair, cut by Travis with a carpenter's chisel and left unpainted, the words remain plain enough to read by lamplight. "Below the wind, for the neighbor you may need to feed." On September the 17th, 1902, with dawn at 33 degrees and a skin of ice returning to rain barrels behind the church, the north field filled before sunrise with wagons carrying salt sacks, split wood, and fresh-cut poles for line repair, because the first communal smoke run had been scheduled for that day, and the schedule was now ordinance, not suggestion. Travis stood at the lower stair with Alina's ledger open on a plank table, reading names and weights in the same steady cadence he had used in the winter of 1889, while Lena Crow, now 28, and appointed school instructor for practical arithmetic, marked each household's contribution on Ruth Ellery's restored slates. No one crossed the street to avoid them. No one laughed at the smell of smoke. The chamber doors opened in sequence, and meat entered by posted order. Oldest families and newest arrivals held to identical measure. The expensive failures from that hard year had not vanished, but they had been demoted to cautionary relics. 2 patent heaters with split seams sat on a shelf in Pemberton's rear room, tagged with cards that listed purchase price and burn duration during the blizzard, and he kept them there where customers waited for flour, so confidence could no longer masquerade as memory. At the church vestibule beside the hymn board, he had framed one surviving scrap of his emergency notice, recovered as pulp and dried flat between book pages, the ink barely legible where it named salt by the ounce at famine rate. Children asked what the scrap meant, and adults answered plainly. At the smokehouses, by contrast, the costs posted each Monday remained modest and exact. Coarse salt, 2 cents per pound under cooperative purchase, cottonwood $1.10 per cord by pooled contract, limestone maintenance funded at $7 each household per year. Ledger against ledger, the town had chosen its teacher. By the 3rd week of October, Travis began the annual instruction cycle for root and vent discipline, and he taught it as craft rather than drama. He had the younger pupils place gloved hands on wall stone to feel retained cool and understand thermal mass without jargon. He had them open and close vent plates by quarter turns while watching wool strips near the shaft, learning to read draw by movement and dryness as he had learned from Alina. He took the old anemometer cup arm, the one that had snapped in the 1889 storm after Jonas shouted the final reading, and mounted it above the school entry as a warning that instruments failed before weather did. He set crews to bell maintenance at each route post and ordered clappers wrapped in waxed cloth after every drill, explicitly naming the night when the first bell froze silent and lantern codes replaced sound. Every flag detail from the disaster became rule, and every rule acquired a steward. Late that same month, Orrin Pemberton asked for an evening meeting at his store after closing, not a public gathering and not a plea. He laid 3 books on the counter under lamplight: his original 1888 credit ledger, the 1889 emergency ledger, and the transparent account book he had kept since reopening at old prices. Travis, Lena, Reverend Hale, and Alma Boone stood with him while he turned pages one by one. He stopped at entries marked with inflated rates and read each family name aloud, then placed silver and grain vouchers in envelopes already addressed, adding interest calculated at 6% across the missing years, because he said profit drawn from fear remained a debt even after apology. He then handed the store keys, briefly and without theater, to Lena, asking her to inspect his stockroom locks and tally against the posted board. She did, found no hidden reserve and no private list, and returned the ring to his palm. "I do not ask you to call me restored," Pemberton said, voice low enough that only those present heard every word. "I ask that the arithmetic remain visible after I am gone, because secrecy is where I first went wrong." Travis answered from the opposite side of the counter, hands resting on rough pine, not offering comfort and not withholding respect. "Visibility is not mercy," he said. "It is maintenance. Keep doing what can be checked, and your name will settle where it settles." That winter passed hard but orderly. On January 6, 1903, the thermometer reached -29 with sustained wind at 40 miles per hour, enough to test every oath made in church and store, and the rope routes filled with disciplined movement rather than panic. Bell clappers rang. Vent caps stayed clear. Broth lines formed by chalk mark, children first, infirm second, labor crews third, and no household arrived empty because reserves had been verified in November. When one West Lane chimney failed draft near midnight, 2 trained teams reached it within 18 minutes by posted interval count, extracted the family, and reopened flow before flame or smoke took a life. The system had become communal muscle. The walls held again, but now 3 chambers held, and each was staffed by neighbors who had once mocked the first. On January the 14th, exactly 14 years after the blizzard broke, Sage Hollow gathered at South Hill where Ruth Ellery, Eli Boone, and Marta Klein lay in adjacent ground. The graves were clean-edged in frozen soil, names dark against pale stone. No speech was given first. Instead, Lena read from the winter ledger line by line: intake counts, ration weights, death notations, route closures, and the hour Pemberton reported for water duty with empty hands. Then Alma Boone read her son's final flour entry and placed beside his marker a new sack of wheat labeled for the school kitchen, symbol chosen by his mother and understood by all. Only after those acts did Reverend Hale speak, stating that memory without procedure was sentiment, and procedure without memory became pride, and he charged each household to keep both. Travis did not live as a monument and did not die in spectacle. On May 3, 1907, at 61 years of age, after checking spring drainage at the church Smokehouse and correcting one sag in the west root rope, he sat on the lower stair of the original Northfield chamber, closed Alana's ledger after entering that day's wall temperature at 52 degrees, and did not rise again. The physician from Granite Falls recorded heart failure, sudden and without prolonged suffering. By his written instruction read aloud that evening, the Northfield chamber was to remain common property under school stewardship. His tools were to be distributed by demonstrated competence rather than kin claim, and Elina's ledger was to be copied each autumn by 2 students and 1 elder, so no page could be lost to fire or neglect. At his burial, Pemberton and Jonas carried the same end of the bier, and Lena walked behind with the ledger wrapped in oilcloth as it had been on the day he arrived. Decades pass in Sage Hollow, but the practice remains in present tense. The smokehouses still stand below the wind, limestone cool in July heat and steady in January dark. Schoolchildren still learn rope intervals before they learn penmanship flourishes, and they recite the old chain of knowledge without embellishment. Elina learned from her father in Finnish winter country. Travis learned from Elina by hand, and Sage Hollow learned from both by hunger and repair. In the store, prices are still posted where every eye can test them. In the church chest, Ruth Ellery's binding cloth remains folded beside attendance slates worn smooth by generations. In the mending room above the Cooper shed, Marta Klein's mitten pattern is copied each fall for trench crews. At Eli Boone's marker, flower offerings are placed every January by families whose names were once written in the rescue columns. On clear autumn evenings when smoke lifts straight and the first frost takes the pump handle, Lena, now gray at the temples and still exact with chalk, opens the school cabinet and brings out the oilcloth bundle before a room of children born long after the blizzard year. She lays Elina's ledger on the desk, turns to the page where Travis wrote, "Do not trust March sun on January stores," and then to the lintel inscription copied in a careful school hand. The words remain plain enough for any child to read by lamplight, and the town reads them together as instruction rather than slogan. Below the wind, for the neighbor you may need to feed.